My name is Mara Sterling, and at 26, I've spent most of my life being the quiet daughter, the research librarian who would rather organize state archives than curate an Instagram feed. But last Christmas, I realized that silence isn't just a trait, it's a vantage point. The Sterling mansion smelled of my mother Beatrice's imported lilies and my father's expensive scotch, a backdrop of curated perfection that was about to shatter. My grandmother, Evie Thorne, sat small and unhurried in her corn-yellow sweater, a stark contrast to the sharp suits and designer silk surrounding her. Please subscribe to support the channel. I bet you're watching this video right now, while lying down with your legs crossed, right? If that's true, type 1. If not, type 2. Let's see whether I got it right. Alright, enough talking. Let's begin the story. When she pulled out 5 cream-colored envelopes, my father, Warren, snatched his first. He expected a token, perhaps a deed or a small payout to cover his mounting real estate debts. But when he saw the number $2 million written in her precise, cartographer's hand, his face went from greed to a dark, condescending twist. "A nice joke, Mom," he laughed, the sound hollow against the wood-paneled walls. "But Monopoly money doesn't pay the bills." With a flick of his wrist, he tore the paper in half, the sound like a gunshot in the room. My mother followed suit, her laughter trilling like a well-practiced performance as she shredded hers into a wine glass. My brother, Pierce, crumpled his like a gum wrapper, and Sloane, ever the influencer, filmed herself dropping hers into the roaring fireplace, whispering cozy grandma vibes to her followers. I watched the number 2, followed by Sow Zero's turn to ash, curling red and black in the heat. My grandmother didn't blink, she only looked at me. I was the only one who folded my check into my purse, feeling the weight of it against my palm. "Thank you, Grandma," I whispered. She nodded once, a secret shared in a room full of blind men. They thought they were destroying a prank, they didn't know they were burning their own futures. To understand why my father thought he could burn $2 million without a second thought, you have to understand the empire he built on sand, and the person I had to become just to survive his shadow. My name is Mara Sterling. I am 26 years old, and for the last 4 years, I've been a research librarian at the state archives. To my family, I am a glorified clerk, a girl who settled for a government salary, while my brother Pierce chased venture capital mirages, and Sloane sold a filtered version of reality to millions of strangers on the internet. My siblings were the stars of the Sterling brand, and I was the girl who stayed in the stacks, surrounded by the cold silence of historical records. I spent my days navigating the humidity-controlled basements of the city, breathing in the scent of decaying paper and the weight of forgotten history. While the rest of my family obsessed over the next quarter's growth, I was learning that everything in this world has a paper trail, if you're patient enough to follow it. In our household, I was a disappointing investment. Warren Sterling measures human value in square footage and interest rates. He deals in commercial real estate, trading in skyscraper dreams, and shopping center blueprints, always leveraging the future to pay for his present luxuries. To him, I lacked the killer instinct required for his world of aggressive acquisitions, despite Pierce's ability to lose family money on failing tech startups. My mother, Beatrice, viewed me as a stylistic error, a woman who preferred the smell of old parchment to the curated elegance of her interior design firm. For years, they viewed my Saturdays with Grandma Eevee as a chore I performed to keep the old lady out of their hair, so they could focus on the serious business of being successful. But here is my promise. By the time this story is over, you will see exactly how a few sheets of torn paper and the meticulous habits of a researcher brought my father's empire to its knees. They laughed at my grandmother's prank because they were so blinded by their own arrogance that they couldn't see the legal landmine she had placed in their hands. They thought they knew every ledger of the Thorne family holdings, but they had forgotten that a research librarian doesn't just read books, she verifies titles, traces liens, and finds the fine print that everyone else is too busy to notice. That Christmas Eve was a reckoning. When my father tore that check, he was triggering a sequence of events that would strip him of his titles and his dignity. He forgot that the daughter he ignored was the one who knew exactly where the foundations were cracked. I am Mara Sterling, and this is the story of the year my family discovered that the quietest person in the room is usually the one who has already documented every one of your mistakes. Growing up in the Sterling household felt like being a footnote in a glossy luxury brochure. While Pierce was being groomed for boardrooms, and Sloane was draped in the latest trends to fit my mother's interior aesthetics, I was the girl in the hand-me-down sweaters, usually found tucked into a corner with a book. To my parents, my silence was a lack of ambition, a convenient vacancy they could ignore because I didn't require the constant PR maintenance my siblings demanded. I remember my 16th birthday clearly. There was no party, just a card signed only by my mother. While Pierce received a vintage sports car for simply graduating middle school, I was the invisible child, the one who stayed behind to help the caterers clear plates while my siblings danced in the spotlight of my father's latest business gala. My father often remarked that I cost the family less than the others, but his tone always implied that I was worth less, too. A low-maintenance asset, with no projected ROI. But my Saturdays at Grandma Eevee's brick house on the edge of the Thorne estate were my quiet rebellion. While my parents saw those visits as a tiresome duty, for me, they were an education in observation. Grandma Eevee, with her sharp eyes and corn-yellow sweater, didn't want a performer. She wanted a witness. We spent hours in her personal study, a room that smelled of old maps and peppermint tea. She was the only one who didn't see my job at the archives as a dead end. She called me the guardian of the truth, a title that carried more weight than any venture partner title Pierce could dream of. She taught me to look past the surface, to see the invisible child not as a victim, but as the one who notices the cracks in the foundation, while everyone else is admiring the paint. While my siblings were busy asking what she could give them, I was the only one who asked her how she felt. We would sit in her garden, the low orange light of autumn hitting the rosemary, and she would tell me stories of the Thorne land stories that weren't in my father's ledgers. I learned that my father's empire was built on land his mother still controlled, a fact he was too arrogant to verify. Those Saturdays weren't just tea and knitting. They were a decade-long training session in the information asymmetry that would eventually lead to their downfall. I was the daughter they forgot to account for. And as Grandma Eevee always said, the person who holds the map is the only one who truly knows where the treasure and the secrets are buried. Leaving the quiet sanctuary of Grandma Eevee's house to return to the Sterling estate was like stepping out of a soft focus memory into a high-definition nightmare of glass and cold marble. My father, Warren, didn't just walk into a room, he occupied it like a hostile acquisition, his presence defined by the sharp scent of expensive scotch and the frantic energy of a man who spent his life leveraging debt to buy prestige. To Warren, land was never a place to grow rosemary or sit in silence. It was a set of coordinates on a map, a square footage calculation designed to yield a commission. He operated on the elite contrast principle, surrounding himself with real estate developers and country club members whose names appeared on bronze plaques. He viewed my mother, Beatrice, as his primary asset in this social theater. Beatrice didn't just design interiors, she curated hierarchies. Her laughter trilling with a not really a smile that served as a gatekeeper for who was deemed worthy of her attention. In their world, my siblings were the shining investments they showcased to the board of public opinion. Pierce, despite burning through 3 of my father's offshore accounts on tech incubators that never hatched, was still the heir apparent, the one whose failures were quietly scrubbed from the narrative. Sloane was the digital extension of my mother's vanity, an influencer who treated every family dinner as a production set, her phone always positioned to capture the perfect family she didn't actually know. They were the golden children, entitled to the front rows and the center tables of life, while I was relegated to the background, the low-maintenance invisible child whose only utility was to manage the inconvenient parts of their reality. The shift in power was subtle but systematic. As Grandma Eevee's hip began to fail and her hands started to shake over her mismatched teacups, Warren and Beatrice saw an opportunity to offload a burden. "Your time is less valuable, Mara," my father would say, his hand resting heavy on his cufflinks as if he were delivering a corporate mandate. Let the professionals handle the business. You just keep the old lady company. They used my genuine love for her as a leash, guilt-tripping me into becoming her primary caregiver so they could remain productive members of society. They weren't protecting her. They were rehearsing for the day they would finally manage her estate out of existence. I was the one who saw the fragility behind the sterling facade. The one who realized that while they were busy polishing the frame, they had completely forgotten to check if there was still anything inside it. The red flags didn't just appear. They bled into the fabric of our daily lives like ink on a damp map. As Grandma Eevee's health began to visibly fray, my parents' concern didn't manifest in doctors' visits or medical consultations, but in a calculated restructuring of my schedule. In the weeks leading up to that fateful Christmas, the Sterling estate was a hive of frantic activity, fueled by the cold adrenaline of impending failure. My father, Warren, was always in his client meeting voice, that smooth, calm, and terrifyingly reasonable tone he used when a deal was going sideways and he needed someone to absorb the loss. He started calling me into his home office, not to ask how my research at the archives was progressing, but to delegate the management of his mother. "Mara, you're already there on Saturdays," he'd say, never looking up from his spreadsheets. "It just makes sense for you to handle her appointments and her groceries. Pierce and Sloan have bigger priorities." Bigger priorities meant more money down the drain of failing tech incubators and curated lifestyles. My mother, Beatrice, reinforced this hierarchy with her signature, not really a smile, a facial expression that looked like hospitality but felt like a locked gate. She began treating my grandmother's house like a problematic project that needed to be staged or hidden away. When I suggested that Eevee needed a professional nurse, Beatrice tilted her head with that familiar look of aristocratic pity. "Oh, Mara, don't be so dramatic. She doesn't need a stranger in her house. She needs her favorite granddaughter. Besides, you have so much free time at that library." It was a calculated decision to turn my love into a form of unpaid labor, ensuring that they remained the faces of the Sterling brand, while I became the invisible buffer between them and the reality of Eevee's decline. They were rehearsing for a future where Eevee was just a name on a deed they already owned. I watched as they spoke over her at the few dinners she attended, treating her like a piece of antique furniture that was losing its luster. They were so busy admiring the frame of their own success that they failed to notice the silence growing between the three of us, Eevee, the garden, and me. They didn't realize that every time they pushed me closer to her, they were handing me the keys to the very secrets they were trying to steal. They viewed me as a pushover, a low-maintenance asset that would keep the ground steady while they prepared for the final takeover. But as I sat in the archives, cross-referencing land titles with Thorne family history, I realized the small battles they thought they were winning were merely rehearsals for a war they weren't prepared to fight. The atmosphere of that Christmas Eve dinner was a masterclass in the elite contrast my mother had spent decades perfecting. The table was a sea of ivory linens and gold-rimmed chargers, the air heavy with the scent of roasted rosemary, and a $5,000 bottle of Bordeaux that my father had likely put on a credit card he couldn't pay off. To any of the invited guests, we looked like the portrait of American success, but sitting in that chair, I felt the structural failure of our family history pressing against my ribs. Grandma Eevee sat at the far end, her corn-yellow sweater, a soft, defiant stain against the sharp black silk of Beatrice's designer dress. She had been quiet all evening, watching Warren hold court about his upcoming acquisitions. The same acquisitions I knew from the archives were technically sitting on Thorne land he didn't own. When the dessert plates were cleared, Eevee cleared her throat in that small, precise way she used to before a piano recital. She reached into a small wooden box and pulled out 5 cream-colored envelopes. "I have one thing to give you," she said, her voice thin but steady, a guardian of truth making her final move. My father opened his first, his movements hurried and greedy, his eyes already calculating the return on investment. When he pulled out the paper, the room went so still I could hear the ice settling in Beatrice's glass. It was a check for $2 million, written in Eevee's unhurried, slanted hand. For a fraction of a second, the mask of the reasonable man slipped, and I saw Warren Sterling's true face, not one of gratitude, but of profound, arrogant contempt. 2 million? He laughed. A dry, hollow sound that echoed off the marble. Mom, for God's sake, we're real estate developers. We deal in billions, not monopoly money and childhood pranks. He dropped the check onto his plate, letting the remaining gravy soak into the corner of the paper, a physical proof of his utter disregard. My mother followed suit, her trilling laughter serving as the smoking gun of her own cruelty. Really, Evie, if you're going to play at being wealthy, at least make the numbers believable, she said, shredding her envelope into a wine glass with a not really a smile that froze my blood. Pierce crumpled his into a ball, flicking it toward the centerpiece as if it were trash, while Sloane, ever the influencer, filmed the entire sensory detail of the humiliation for her followers, whispering about Grandma's cognitive decline. It was the betrayal of the partner and the child all at once. They didn't just reject the money, they rejected her humanity. I watched the number 2 with 6 zeros behind it blacken and curl as Sloane finally dropped hers into the fireplace, a symbol of freedom they were unwittingly handing back to the archives. My grandmother didn't blink. She looked only at me, her eyes sharp and unmistakable. I reached out, my hands steady, and folded my check into my purse. "Thank you, Grandma," I said, my voice the only honest thing left in the room. She gave a single nod, a locked gate closing behind her. They thought they had tapped into the lie, but they had just signed the DNR on their own futures. I sat there, the weight of the folded check in my purse, feeling like a lead weight against my hip, while the trilling laughter of my mother and the sharp, arrogant bark of my father filled the gaps where a family's dignity should have been. The silence from my grandmother was absolute, a heavy, dignified quiet that they mistook for defeat, but which I knew was the final, irreversible closing of a door. I looked at the check sitting on my father's plate, the slanted blue ink of Grandma Eevee's handwriting now blurred by the greasy residue of a dinner he hadn't even earned. I felt a desperate, lingering need to bridge the gap, not for the money, but to save him from the catastrophic fallout I could see looming on the horizon of the next 72 hours. I reached out, my hand trembling slightly as I touched my father's sleeve, the fine, Italian wool that he wore like armor. "Dad," I whispered, my voice cutting through his anecdote about a new shopping center project. "Please, just for a second, look at what you're doing. You're calling her senile, but you haven't even looked at the routing numbers. You're throwing away more than paper." I was attempting a triage of our relationship, a final, peaceful resolution before the truth detonated. I wanted him to apologize, to reach across the table and take her hand, to admit that the woman who raised him wasn't a childhood prank to be managed. Warren didn't even turn his head. He just adjusted his cufflinks, silver monograms that looked like tiny, locked gates, and sighed that particular, long-suffering sigh he reserved for when I was being difficult. "Mara, sweetheart," he said, his voice dropping into that smooth, practiced tone he used to handle emotional clients when a deal was turning sour. "You're stressed. You spend too much time in those archives, surrounded by dust and dead things. You've lost your sense of reality." He patted my hand, a rehearsed, hollow gesture that held no warmth. "Let's not ruin Christmas Eve with your theatrics. We're all having a lovely time, and your grandmother is perfectly fine. She's had her fun." My mother, Beatrice, leaned in then, her not really a smile tightening the skin around her eyes until she looked like a ceramic mask. "Mara, listen to your father. Don't make trouble on account of us," she said, echoing the very words my mother had used in a different life, at a different table. They weren't dismissing my opinion, they were dismissing my existence as a rational person. They were so convinced of their own elite contrast that they couldn't conceive of a reality where the invisible child saw more than the real estate developer. The compromise died right there, between the seared salmon and the butternut squash bisque. I realized then that I was trying to save people who were already flatlining morally. I pulled my hand back, feeling the cold hardwood of the table, and I stopped explaining. I didn't need a microphone yet. I just needed the morning to come. The house was eerily silent when I left, the smell of charred paper from the fireplace still hanging in the hallway like a ghost of the night before. I walked into First National Hollow Ridge at 9:02 a.m., the physical evidence of my family's arrogance tucked securely inside my bag. Benedict Strom, the bank manager with the same mustache he'd had since I was a teenager, smiled warmly when he saw me approach. But that smile died the moment I slid the cream cardstock across his desk, and he saw the slanted blue ink of Grandma Eevee's signature. He didn't just verify the document. His reaction was a sensory detail of someone witnessing a miracle or a crime. He stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the linoleum, and led me toward a small private room. Once inside, he turned the small brass latch with a sharp click, a locked gate that finally separated me from my father's version of reality. "Mara," he said, his professional mask completely crumbling as he sat across from me. "I was the one who helped her draft these in November. I saw every digit go into that specialized account." He confirmed that the $2 million was fully funded and legitimate, but then he leaned forward, his voice dropping into a clinical voice of sheer gravity. "This check is only the beginning, sweetheart. There are records here that your father never once bothered to ask about." He revealed that Grandma Eevee hadn't just been sorting her garden during those long Saturdays, she had been sorting the Thorn heritage. Through a series of private trusts, she had spent 30 years quietly buying up the deeds to the very commercial plazas and subdivision lands that Warren Sterling had been bragging about at the country club for decades. I realized then that my father's empire was a house of cards built on ground he assumed was his birthright, but which Eevee had legally anchored to me. The invisible child was no longer just a footnote in the Sterling brochure. I was now the landlord of my father's pride. Benedict handed me the contact information for a lawyer named Halverson, and as I stepped back out into the January air, I knew the karma wasn't just coming, it was already meticulously documented. I walked out of the bank with a cold, clinical clarity that I had previously only reserved for indexing the most complicated state land grants. I didn't head back to the mansion to shout at my father, or show my mother the verified balance. I wasn't looking for an emotional scene. I was looking for the structural logic of my counterstrike. I drove instead to the State Archives, my sanctuary of quiet records, and met with Halverson in the flickering light of the basement study. He was a man of long pauses and cello string gravity, the kind of attorney who understands that the loudest truths are the ones printed on notarized paper. For 3 days, we performed a meticulous triage of the Thorn Sterling history. While Warren was busy preparing for his regional development announcement at the Hollow Ridge Country Club, I was documenting the exact coordinates of his impending collapse. Halverson showed me the medical capacity evaluations, 3 separate exams, all clean, all conducted in the months leading up to that Christmas dinner, proving Grandma Eevee was the sharpest person in any room she occupied. We gathered the physical evidence, the trust records, the original land deed she'd acquired while Warren was busy ignoring her, and the bank timestamps from the night he tore the check. It was an architecture of truth to counter the architecture of deception he had built over 30 years. I could have handled this in a private living room, but I chose my stage with the same precision my grandmother used to map territory. I chose the Thorn Sterling Anniversary Gala, the very event my father used to cement his status in the community, the place where he played the reasonable man for the local elite. He had spent decades building an image of the self-made tycoon, and I was going to let him step into that spotlight one last time before I pulled the thread. I kept my voice steady, my movements rehearsed. I wasn't acting out of anger. I was acting out of the bone. Deep knowledge that the people you love deserve a version of the truth they can no longer outrun. I wore my simple librarian's dress and carried a manila folder like a shield. I wasn't a daughter begging for a seat at the table anymore. I was the one who had finally realized that in a world of filtered lies, the only thing that holds weight is the record. The Thorn Sterling Anniversary Gala was a sea of crystal chandeliers and gold-rimmed chargers, the air heavy with the elite contrast of 200 guests who mistook Warren Sterling's leveraged debts for true success. My father stood at the mahogany podium, his voice the very definition of the reasonable man, as he delivered a speech about family legacy and the tragic cognitive decline of his mother. He smiled that practiced, hollow smile, inviting the room to pity him for the burden of managing Grandma Eevee's estate while portraying her as a financial drain. I watched from the shadows near the bar, my manila folder feeling like a symbol of freedom tucked under my arm. When he paused for applause, I didn't wait for an invitation. I stepped onto the stage, my heels clicking a steady rhythm like a metronome on the polished hardwood. The room faded table by table as I approached the center stage. The MC, a man who had laughed with Warren at the country club for years, faltered as I reached for the microphone. I took it with a hand that didn't shake, a guardian of truth, finally claiming the mic drop moment. "Thank you all for being here to celebrate the sterling legacy," I said, my voice coming through the speakers clear and factual, like a researcher reading a land grant into the public record. I saw my father's mask slip by a fraction of a second, his ceramic smile hardening into dawning terror as I turned to him. "But a legacy isn't built on speeches, Dad. It's built on paper." I opened the folder, the physical evidence of a structural failure decades in the making. 12 days ago, on Christmas Eve, my father tore up a $2 million check from my grandmother, calling it a childhood prank. I told the silent crowd, letting the math settle over the room as I saw major partners like Jim Henderson put down their forks. He told the room she was senile. He didn't know that I had the routing numbers verified by Benedict Strom at 9:02 a.m. the following morning. But I wasn't just there to talk about a check. He also didn't realize that while he was ignoring her for 10 years, she was quietly buying the deeds to every subdivision he claims to own. I continued, the truth showing up with a force that made the hallway tilt for him. "I have the medical capacity evaluations here, dated and notarized by Dr. Okafor, proving she was the sharpest person in our family tree, while you were calling her a plumber and a lunch lady's equivalent of a drain." The room fractured with gasps as the public moral collapse began. Warren tried to step forward, his voice a raw whisper of, "This isn't the place." But I didn't raise my voice, I just held the mic. "You chose a gala to lie about her, Dad. I'm choosing this stage for the record." I saw the investors moving their chairs back, creating distance from a man who was no longer safe to stand next to. I set the microphone down on the stand, no slam, no drop, and walked toward the exit, leaving the sterling architecture of deception to crumble under its own weight. The silence that followed my departure from the gala didn't last. It was replaced by the deafening roar of a moral deconstruction that began the very next morning. As I returned to the quiet aisles of the archives, the Sterling Empire began to suffer a slow, steady erosion of the reputation my father had spent 30 years manufacturing. Consequences in our world don't always arrive with a shout. Sometimes they come as a phone call on a Monday morning. Jim Henderson, my father's primary development partner, was the first to pull the thread. He didn't just walk away from the podium, he called Warren to formally withdraw from the Oak Ridge project, stating clearly that if a man could treat his own mother like a financial drain and a prank, he could never be trusted to treat a business partner with integrity when things got difficult. Without Henderson's capital and the Thornland deeds I now controlled, the project, and my father's liquidity stalled indefinitely. The lurid Hoaqua, karma, moved through the Sterling household like a cold front. My mother, Beatrice, found that her not really a smile could no longer open doors in the high society circles she craved. Clients began quietly canceling their interior design consultations, uncomfortable with the optics of her public participation in Grandma Eevee's humiliation. Even the Hope Foundation, where she had chaired the annual gala for years, invited her to step back to focus on family, leaving her name off the very programs she used to define her worth. The social capital she had traded in for decades had reached a flatline. Behind the scenes, the truth continued to do its work. Carl, the notary who had historically been a friend to my father's aggressive business tactics, realized the structural failure of the Sterling brand and contacted Halverson to cooperate. He provided a confession regarding several documents Warren had tried to push through in the weeks before Christmas, fearing he would be named in a formal forgery and fraud investigation. My father didn't just lose his prestige, he lost his accomplices. My brother Pierce and sister Sloane face their own public moral collapse. Without the Thorn land to leverage for their venture capital fantasies and lifestyle videos, the banks began a mortgage freeze on my father's secondary properties, cutting off the allowance that fueled their filtered realities. I didn't have to orchestrate their downfall. I simply provided the physical evidence of their character, and the community did the rest. This was justice served, not through a scheme of revenge, but through the architecture of a life lived honestly. They were finally meeting the full weight of a mistake they could never undo. And for the first time in 60 years, my father had absolutely nothing to say because the silence was the only honest thing he had left. 6 months have passed since the night the Sterling name stopped being a brand and started being a debt. I'm sitting in Grandma Eevee's garden now, where the rosemary we pruned together is finally beginning to thrive in the soft light of a Maine spring. The Thorn house doesn't smell like imported lilies or expensive scotch anymore. It smells of old books, sea salt, and the cedar-scented tranquility of a life that is finally, legally, and spiritually mine. I am no longer the invisible child or a footnote in my father's commercial real estate brochures. I am the librarian who spent a decade indexing the truth, and I have finally moved into a house where every chair is a seat at a table I control. The restoration of my sovereignty didn't come with a grand celebration, but with the quiet sound of a latch falling into place. Through the Sylvia Thorne Foundation, I've ensured that the land my father tried to leverage will now support the local library and the archives that gave me my strength. My father called once last week not to apologize, but to ask about a minor legal detail regarding a lien. I didn't get angry. I didn't even feel the old, heavy ache between my ribs. I simply told him that all communication must go through Halverson. It wasn't a choice made from spite. It was an act of architecture. I've learned that setting a boundary isn't about closing a door because you hate the person outside. It's about guarding the peace inside. My mother, Beatrice, sent a card recently, her handwriting less certain than it used to be. She asked if we could do a quiet lunch without the cameras or the performance. I haven't answered yet. I'm still figuring out how wide I want that door to open, and for the first time in 26 years, the timing is entirely on my terms. I'm sitting on the porch swing now, wearing the corn yellow sweater Grandma Eevee left on the back of her chair. A cardinal has just landed at the feeder, taking one seed, before disappearing into the pines, exactly the way it did when we were just a research librarian and a cartographer sharing a secret. I'm no longer waiting for them to see me. I saw myself first, and that turned out to be the only recognition that ever mattered. I have a mismatched teacup in my hand, a garden that is finally mine to sort, and a future that isn't defined by the mistakes of my father's empire. This was my story of a check that was torn, and a truth that refused to be silenced. But now, I want to hear yours. Have you ever been sitting at a table 14 inches your own life, made to feel small by the very people who should have championed you? Did you find the courage to stand up, even without a microphone? Leave me a comment below with the name of the person who taught you that your value is more than a line item on someone else's ledger. I read every one of them. And if you're still looking for the strength to set your own boundaries, there's another story waiting for you in the description that begins with a choice you might recognize. Mara Sterling's journey serves as a profound testament to the truth that family value must always transcend material wealth. The most vital lesson drawn from her story is that setting a boundary is not an act of malice or revenge. It is a fundamental requirement for psychological and spiritual survival. It is the quiet, courageous act of reclaiming one's architecture, the right to define one's own space, and control who is allowed to enter it. The educational value of this narrative lies in its guardian of truth philosophy. It demonstrates that the invisible observer, the one who keeps the records and notices the cracks in the foundation, holds the ultimate power in a world often blinded by filtered lies and arrogant posturing. It teaches that integrity is a patient witness. The truth does not expire, but rather waits for the appropriate stage to reveal the structural failures of an unethical legacy. Ultimately, the story empowers the marginalized to stop waiting for external validation. It asserts that you must see yourself first, building a life of dignity and consistent character that no amount of leveraged debt or deception can deconstruct. True victory is found in becoming someone who no longer needs the approval of those who only saw you as a line item on a ledger.